Welcome to the Falling Walls Plenary Table. Big Science for the Future, Rekindling Transatlantic Partnerships.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Georg Schütte. I'm Secretary General of the Volkswagen Foundation, and I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce you now to this afternoon's panel. This is a panel that brings together people like at all the Falling Walls circles. It brings together people from different realms of science and society. It brings together global leaders in research, in policy, in business and policy making, and the media. We will have a panel discussion that starts with a short exchange and introductory statements by our panelists, and then we engage into an internal discussion, which will be then opened up to you and others who follow us on the screen. So, who are my panelists who will discuss together with me the topic Big Science for the Future, Rekindling Transatlantic Partnership? It's my honor to introduce to you Darion Akins. He is Consul General of the United States of America in Hamburg, representing the ambassador to the German states of Hamburg, Lower Saxony, Bremen, Schleswig-Holstein, and Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania. He was at the Executive Office for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs and International Organizations. He holds a master's degree in national security strategy at the National War College, and a warm welcome to Darion Akins. Professor Sibylle Günter will also join us. She is the scientific director of the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics, with 2 locations close to Munich and in Greifswald. She holds a degree in physics from Rostock University and now is a professor at the 2 sites in Rostock, at the seashore of the Baltic Sea, and at the Technical University of Munich. Sibylle Günter, welcome. Thank you very much. Eric Isaac joins us from the United States of America as well. He's the 11th president of the Carnegie Institution for Science. This is a private, non-profit research organization, and the headquarters is in Washington, D.C. Eric Isaacs is a physicist as well. He holds a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He worked for 15 years at Bell Laboratories and was also director of the Argonne National Laboratory, and at that time he was also deeply involved in academic affairs. He was provost at the University of Chicago. Eric Isaac, thanks for being with us today. Dame Ottoline Leyser is a professor and research group leader at the Sainsbury Laboratory of the University of Cambridge. She holds her PhD in genetics from the University of Cambridge, and during her time as a postdoctoral researcher also worked at Indiana University. She is a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire and currently chairs the Royal Society's Science Policy Expert Advisory Committee and also serves on the Council for Science and Technology. Thank you very much, Dame Ottoline, for being with us. And last but not least, Charlotte Lindberg Warakaulle joins us. She is the CERN Director for International Relations and has been in this position since 2016. She, as a matter of fact, is the first CERN Director for International Relations. And she has worked prior to that at the United Nations in different capacities in the Geneva office. So it was a move from the United States to CERN in the neighborhood. Charlotte holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Cambridge and in history also from the University of Copenhagen. and she was, amongst others, visiting research fellow at the Lucy Cavendish College, funded by the Carlsberg Foundation. So it's my pleasure to discuss. First, a warm welcome to Charlotte. And it is my pleasure to talk and discuss with this group about big science for the future. If we look at our environment, we see floods and fires, we see violence and viruses. We do see, as a matter of fact, existential threats that humanity is facing, threats that affect every society around the globe. And we have to bring the best minds in science and research together to tackle these challenges. National borders are irrelevant to the challenges, but at the same time, we also see that science has to reach out to domestic publics, to domestic audience, in order to make itself understood. Before we start to discuss this question, I will move to the table and ask all the panelists for a brief opening statement. So give me a second and I move over there. So when we prepared for this panel, we asked all panelists to answer one question, which they thought about prior to coming here, but I would like to ask everyone to just rethink the original written answer and provide us with a somewhat remodeled new one. The question was whether the pandemic, the climate crisis, increasing skepticism about science or political polarization, the scientific community itself faces several challenges. How can they be masters? What should be prioritized? And if we just move around the table and I ask you to make a first start, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think these are really important times as we, as a world, emerge from the pandemic, which has been such a powerful illustrator of the extraordinary role that science can play. And crucially, this is a role not in eliminating uncertainty, not in providing magic solutions, but in navigating uncertainty and weaving those into the fabric of wider society so that collectively, as a community, we can solve some of these global challenges. And I think the climate change is another example. It's the same kind of global crisis playing out in much slower time, but nonetheless an emergency where we need the same thing. We need to bring people together as a global community to find solutions that are acceptable in the multiple different contexts in which we're working. So I think you're right, it's crucial to break down the walls at the Falling Walls Conference between science as the domain of some strange experts and wider society, whom science must serve, to build that trust. And it's got to be mutual trust. Scientists have to trust everybody else, and everybody else has to trust scientists. And that's a relationship building exercise. So I think that's the most important thing, that none of these extraordinary tools that we have to help us navigate the uncertainties of the world will be able to deliver if it's not done by the people and for the people.
Thank you very much. Sibylle Günter.
Yeah, you asked what should we prioritize, but this is a tough question given these challenges. You know, I mean, you cannot prioritize the pandemic versus climate change. So I think we have to tackle them all together. And I think that we can learn a little from these big research projects we have. I mean, we have a CERN representative here. My community has a big ITER project in France. And I think what we can learn from this is that we build scientific communities all over the world. We jointly educate students or people, and we really focus also on some science communication to bridge the gap to the public. I'm not saying that every of these challenges should have big research infrastructures, but maybe we can learn to glue a scientific community together by maybe joint funding of competitive projects.
Thank you very much. Darion Akins, you've been in Germany in this capacity now for more or less 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. So you took a fresh glimpse at issues like this. How do you perceive the situation?
I think you're right. It's absolutely essential that we cooperate and that we work together. The challenges that the world faces are challenges that no single country, for example, can solve. So it speaks to that we have to work together. However, it needs to be done in the context of, for example, what are our values? Because as we look forward and we see some scientific innovations that are coming online, we want to make sure that it's done in a way that supports our values. In the case of democratic nations, that it supports our democratic values. One example I would give, it would be, as we look at AI, we can see that there are challenges on the horizon, and we want to make sure that as that is developed, that we as democratic nations, for example, discuss what are the values, what do we want to make sure are the key elements that build that road and the safeguards that are there, so that it supports our values as we innovate into the future.
Thank you very much. Eric Isaac, a perspective from a physicist deeply involved into basic research, I suppose.
Yeah. So I would say there are sort of, maybe I think about it in 3 different categories. And first, we've already talked about what are the important problems. And I don't think we have a dearth of big problems. You mentioned, everyone's mentioned climate, there's food, there's water, poverty. Those are big problems. Energy is a big part of that. So these are big problems. And I'm not so worried that we can't identify the big problems. So I think that's first and foremost, we have that, and I'm not worried about it. The second is the approach, and this is where I think, a little bit to what Ottoline said, it's got to be a very collaborative, diverse approach. And it's diversity in many different ways. So to solve an energy problem like batteries, you need big machines like synchrotrons, you need the instruments, but you also need diversity of people, and that's another part where just came from a very good session just before this one on gender. It's really imperative that we figure out how to get more people into it. But the last thing about approach is it comes back to the communications piece. Scientists, as much as I love to say we could solve all the world's problems, cannot. Technologies like batteries, like these things, we can fix that problem. Those aren't out of our reach, but it's how do we communicate? How do we make sure it's inclusive, and not just inclusive so everyone gets to vote on what the chemicals in the battery are, but more importantly, people understand the problem and understand why we have to solve it. And therefore, I think reporters have to be involved, and people in the political realm have to be involved. And the last thing I'll say is leadership, because we can't do everything. And one of the things I think that we're struggling with around the world now is good leadership. And I'm not going to mention any names or anything, but thinking about, you and I talked about this last night, Ottoline, thinking about aligning, we're already doing, the UK, Germany, the US is already doing a lot of work in energy, a lot of work in climate, but we're not very much aligned. So the question is, how do we down-select the problems we're looking at, fund them, but also how do we figure out how to collaborate on those things? I think leadership is going to be really important, and I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you very much. Charlotte, you're working at a site which is international by nature. What's your take on this?
It's certainly a big question and an important one. I can very much align myself also with the previous speakers. I wanted maybe to come back specifically to the issue of engagement also with society and overcoming uncertainty and dealing with uncertainty. I think there's a great importance in building trust amongst scientists and across communities and within society, where it's important that we are better at explaining what the scientific method is. What is the scientific endeavor? How do we build evidence, and how does that evolve over time? And then how does that then support good decision making? That also comes back to the issue of leadership, and how do leaders get the right information so that they can make good choices, and how does that evolve over time? And I think if the crisis has shown us anything, is that we as scientists and as scientific collaborations need to get better at explaining how it is we do science in order to build that trust with the community around us.
Thank you very much. If we talk about reaching out to different groups in society, if we think about politics, national elections are not being won on issues of international collaboration, and they are not being won on issues of science, research, and technology. The last one is too complicated, and the other one is too far away. So, Ottoline, Dame Ottoline, you mentioned in your written statement that scientists have to leave their comfort zone. What is the comfort zone? Is it the research where they struggle hard to find the right answer? Some perceive that as uncomfortable. But where should they go? How should they reach out to different groups outside of science and research, given the obstacles just mentioned?
So I agree with you. Doing science is hard. And I think one of the things we've told ourselves as scientists over the years is that we are scientists. And because we are scientists, we have this, we're on this kind of inexorable march to the truth, and if we stick to the method, we will. So that's how we comfort ourselves with this big kind of "we are experts" label. And what we've seen so clearly in the pandemic is, yes, we are experts, we have expertise, but that is only part of what you need to solve these global challenges, and you will not be able to do that unless you have deep engagement and respect and collaboration with that much wider range of activity that's needed to really to take on these problems. So I think scientists need to let go of their expert label, be proud of what they know and what they can contribute, absolutely, but listen to the inputs of all the other communities that are needed to allow us to build those truly integrated solutions that will bring people with us to solve the problems. And I think a lot of the divisions we're seeing and the political driving force at the moment is based partly on the fact that we've built societies which are very unequal, with the kind of expert class who feel empowered, like things are going in a good direction, and people who feel very disenfranchised and disempowered. And that's why bringing all of that back together again is so important to make the knowledge economy, the technology, the disruptive economy, something that everybody can feel part of and excited about. Everybody can see their role in that. And that's where scientists have to step out of their comfort zone. They have to step into that much wider collaborative space. We're used to collaborating with other scientists. We have to collaborate with everybody.
Thank you very much. Eric, you wrote that science has to transcend both national borders as well as borders of ideology. If we look at ideological divides within our respective societies, what can scientists do to cross that ideological border barrier within a society?
Well, that is the big question. I mean, first of all, I think scientists, a little bit to what Ottoline said, scientists themselves have to get out and try to not just educate talking down to people, really educate people as to what they're doing. But I think there's one word which I hear all the time now, especially with the pandemic. It's the word "the," which makes a big difference. I just started thinking about this. So people say, the science says something. Of course, what is the? There's nothing. There's not the science. Science is a process. It's not the science. It's not an answer. It's not like, frankly, like a Bible. It is really something which. So I think one of the keys is to start having scientists even think about what they're saying and how they're saying it, because I think words matter a lot. The U.S. had a president who used the word "the" in a funny way once, and I think scientists, not just scientists, but people talking about science. So I think it does come back to communication, and I think kids growing up in school, if you can keep them excited at science, when they get to college, they ought to absolutely learn how to write. They ought to absolutely learn how to speak. They ought to absolutely learn how to communicate, whether it's with their aunt and uncle or whether it's with the general public. But I do think we have to be really leery about the kind of language we use, with the presumptions we use about our own profession.
Charlotte, can we learn from CERN? You're the first director of international relations, so you have a dual challenge: reach out internationally, as well as have scientists reach out to their respective communities. What does CERN do to support these two outreach efforts?
I can very much agree with both of the previous speakers on the importance of communication and maybe stepping out of the comfort zone. And there's no doubt that we as a large infrastructure have also been stepping up our efforts in this respect. When we look at the long-term prospects for our field and the prospects for other scientific fields, it's very, very important that we bring all of them with us, also that we reach out not just to the next generation of scientists, but also to other scientific fields. And I think an important word here is also multidisciplinarity. I think that also came up in something that Ottoline was saying earlier, that we need to step out of comfort zones and reach out to audiences and publics and communities that we may not otherwise reach out too. So we have certainly been increasing our efforts in this respect, also reaching out both on social media and building a large education and outreach center in order to reach a younger generation and encourage them and inspire them with the science that we do, and also demystify what we're doing and make them feel part of it through hands-on experiments, etc., so they understand what the process is. And I think there is a need to do much more of that.
Thank you very much. If we look back and look at the name of this conference, Falling Walls, when the Iron Curtain fell at the end of the 20th century, 1989, 1990, and Europe started to reunite again, we saw that a bipolar world started to fade away and we entered a multipolar world. Now let's look back 5 years from today. I remember that at that time it was election day in the United States and Donald Trump was elected president. And the slogan was America First. And we here on this side of the Atlantic thought, wow, what's going to happen here? And just like always, it's not the German electorate that elects an American president, it's the American people. And they voted for a political approach that said America first, let's look at national interest first. And it had an effect in science and research. And yet, the Trump administration always proposed to cut back the budget of the science and research organizations in the United States, and Congress always voted against it, and budgets, as a matter of fact, even increased. So there was a tension between the United States, but everybody else was now sort of, on the one hand, afraid what's going to happen in the United States, one of the, at least West German, closest ally, also in science and research. And at the same time, people started to think, do we have to think about Europe first or second as well? Do we have to compete about academic talent? So I turn to you, Consul Darion Akins. What's your take on the current state of transatlantic collaboration in science and research and the prospects of it?
So let me start with a slight story very quickly. When I arrived in my position, I would often go to speeches by politicians and they would start those speeches with after World War II or after the fall of the wall. And I have said that that probably is not the optimal place to start the conversation. We need to start the conversation with issues that affect people today, such as climate change, such as a greener economy, such as a 21st century economy. So that's first. But it's also reminding people that the relationships are there and they're strong. So I'll give you one example. 5 to 10 grants are reviewed and cleared through the U.S. Embassy here in support of science and research between our two countries. 5 to 10 grants per week. Per week. Those are the kinds of statistics that I have to remind people of how close this relationship is. And let me just end with this. The biggest example that I can give is BioNTech and Pfizer. People tend to forget that those are German and American companies coming together to work for the benefit of the world to solve one of the more pressing problems facing the world today. We should not forget that. We have to remind people of that. And so that's what I try to do. I try to remind individuals, here's where we are, here are the pressing problems, and here's what we're doing to resolve those problems, and make them aware of how robust that cooperation is.
Thank you. Dame Ottoline, the United Kingdom is repositioning itself somewhere in between Europe, being part of it, and being no longer part of the European Union, a political entity, and globally. That's the global British approach that we see now. How do you perceive challenges to international collaboration from a European and an Anglo-Saxon, maybe transatlantic angle?
So I think I would echo the points of a lot of people here that we face a lot of global challenges. And so in many ways, the interests of a large number of countries are aligned. And that's an opportunity to use science not only to solve the problems we have, but also for collaborative diplomacy. And I think, typically divisions within societies, between countries and so on, are often driven by fear and by inequalities. And where we can use the extraordinary power of science to mitigate some of those fears and inequalities, I think we really have a tremendous opportunity to build a much more equitable and collaborative world where we take very seriously our responsibilities as the occupants of this planet. And so, whilst on the one hand it's totally Pollyanna of me to say there are endless win-win situations that we can find, on the other hand, I think unless one has that as an option, then you are almost inevitably retracting into the divisive situation that is easy to find ourselves in. And I think scientists have an interesting role to play because so much of what we do is actually completely bottom-up driven. It's people in country A and country B with a shared vision for solving some problem or pushing back the frontiers of knowledge who will collaborate with one another despite all kinds of possibilities. And that's something we need to watch. It's not that's without its security risks, for example, but nonetheless, that really extraordinary power of human curiosity and ingenuity that can reach right around the world is something that is a force for good that we can capture, I think.
Sibylle Günter, fusion research is one of those areas which are extremely expensive. Even a national facility like the one in Greifswald costs millions of euro. If we look at ITER, we talk about billions of euro. And your research and experiments pay into the larger challenge of making ITER a facility that can demonstrate that fusion energy has the ability to be a resource of power in the future of electrical power. So it requires both collaboration on a scientific level, and at the same time it addresses an issue, electricity supply, that has a political nature. And so countries are competing for progress in this regard. How do you perceive this tension of individual collaboration and international political tension and competition?
Well, so far it is still to a large extent the curiosity-driven research to find out how this can happen, how can this work. And ITER in particular has been set up, I mean, as you know, we just discussed it, as a project jointly by Gorbachev and Reagan during the Cold War. And so they agreed on that, while every country produces something, brings it there, is the most collaborative, maybe not the most economic approach. And they then also kind of have done, however, also the knowledge of every single technology component to bring it back home. So the idea was that every country, including, for example, India, those who really need energy but are not yet at the frontier of science, that they would be able to build a fusion device as well. So in that sense, it is very collaborative. It's very much science diplomacy. And sure, there is competition in the sense that which scientists brought on top what, but we still publish everything and kind of is really a very friendly collaboration. For example, you just mentioned our big facility in Greifswald. There we have people from all over the world, in particular US. We have a lot of collaborative projects, and I think this is the way to go, in a sense. Also, of course, you try to have it to make it a little give and take, at least as much as the individuals can contribute.
Well, Consul Akins, you said many speeches began with after the Second World War or after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Well, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the scientific world has changed, and we now see a somewhat multipolar world with different hubs of scientific research, increasing opportunities, win-win situations for scientific collaboration, and at the same time increasing competition for talent, for example. Eric, you wrote an email a couple of days ago to colleagues at DESY, who were instrumental to bring this group together, by the way, so thanks to our friends at DESY. And you wrote an email and alerted us to...
I thought that was a private email.
Who knows? Well, it was forwarded to me at least.
Okay.
Well, it was public domain knowledge saying that there are hindrances for Chinese researchers to come to the United States, because visas are no longer being given to a number of researchers from China. And reading newspapers and scientific journals, we can also learn that there is an increasing demand to know more about Chinese collaborative ties of researchers in the United States, but not only in the United States, in Europe as well. At the same time, we see China, a country that brought millions of people out of poverty into a middle class and has a very ambitious plan to move ahead in science and research. How do we deal with a country like China that might not share our democratic value, at the same time brings people out of poverty and is extremely ambitious?
Yeah. No, and that's a very complex question, and I won't even pretend to be able to answer all of it, but let me say a couple things in that regard. You know, the U.S. has thrived entirely, as I think the EU has, by immigration. So there's no question that, you know, my grandparents were immigrants from Hungary. So, you know, people immigrated to the U.S., and that's what's created, that's why it has been such a great place for research. And that is a concern, that, you know, that the U.S., to be really blunt, could become a flyover country, right? And Chinese can come here or not. So, but China does, it's an interesting problem, and I think it's as much political as it is scientific. I think all scientists, probably everyone around this table is going to agree, we got to collaborate, right? There's a lot we need to collaborate about. There's also things that you may not want to. There are things that may be more of national interest. But I'm going to say one thing, and then I can let my colleague here, Darion, say something else. But if you look at the politics of most of our institutions, I mean, take the EU, take the US, the way we generate money, frankly, for our research is through competition. I mean, if I went to my congressman and said, we're going to go collaborate, we're going to put in, you know, $1 billion and spend it here, and we have at CERN, but it's a much more difficult argument. So there is a political aspect, which I think we need to get over, but it is the way funding gets done. Same thing in China. China is now becoming a powerhouse, and they want to, frankly, dominate certainly the area. So they're also going to be pushing this more of a nationalistic approach than we are. So I don't know where the boundary is, and I can't give you the answer as what we need to figure that one out, but I don't totally know how we're going to. And the last thing I would say is that it's not just security issues, it's not just and I'll give you an example, which is about accelerator physics. You know, if you go back, you know, both the EU, particularly Germany, and the US have developed a certain technology that enables us to make accelerators hopefully smaller and smaller. It's called superconducting RF, and it's a very difficult technology to master. And it's been mastered here, it's been mastered in the US. It hasn't been mastered in China yet. So China would love to share it with us. It's cost the US billions of dollars to develop it. It's cost the EU billions of euros to develop it. How do we deal with a technology like that? As scientists, we say, share it, of course, because we give, we get. But if you look at a national interest, you might say, what? You know, your taxpayers, everyone who's not a scientist, just put billions of dollars into this project. So how do you manage that politically versus, so the national versus the collaborative versus the competitive part? And I don't have an answer, but I think that has to be answered.
It used to be a give and take consensus that was the basis for this type of exchange, but it may no longer be the case. Darion, what's your take?
As I previously said, that collaboration is absolutely essential. And so there are problems in the world that cannot be solved without collaboration, climate change being one of them. That will not be solved without China's cooperation and collaboration. However, there are rules, there need to be rules about how we collaborate. General principles. I can think of 3 off the top of my head, which is academic freedom, critical discourse, and the protection of intellectual property rights. Those could be 3 tenets, for example, before we talk about how we're going to collaborate, that we agree to these principles. And without that, it may be difficult to collaborate. Clearly understanding that the problems that we face in the world requires everyone to contribute. But we have to be true to our democratic values. We should not allow a system to be constructed where it undermines our values. We have to be very clear. If you lay the tracks this way, that's the way the train will go. And we have to be very careful to make sure that as we look at this, that it goes in a direction that does not undermine our values.
Thank you very much. This was a signal that we can and should open the debate to the audience here in the room and online. So let me ask you here, do you have any questions to this wonderful panel, or are there online questions that might pop up now?
Yes, let's start then with an online question. So one question that came up from the online audience. In discussing collaboration and funding, I would like to get your opinion on the funding issue. A lot of big projects end up failing because of insufficient funding. But in reality, compared to many other expenses done by a lot of the countries we're discussing, these expenses are relatively small compared to, for example, defense. How do we perhaps rethink this funding issue in the future?
Let's turn to two funders. First, UK Research and Innovation. Please, Ottoline, Leyser.
Yes, so funding is important. You can't do the work unless you have the money. And I think it's always going to be a challenge for governments to balance the many things they have to balance. There's the revenues from both individual and corporate taxes, and there are the services that governments are trying to deliver, from health services, all of the things that we really care about, and defence would certainly be one of those things too. And so it's a balance. The power of research and innovation, though, as a place to invest public money, is that it grows public money. So if it's done well, that investment should drive sustainable economic growth in a way that builds the economic potential of countries and allows them to have more money that they can invest in that much wider range of things. So the arguments that certainly we've all been making to our government are precisely that investment is an investment. It's an investment that will grow and provide resources for all of those other things that we need. Another key reason for taking down the walls between research and innovation and wider society is to build the level of public trust that's essential both for a successful research and innovation endeavour, but also for the continued will of the people to invest in their futures.
Thank you. And Eric Isaacs, the funding landscape in the United States has changed with new tech companies and tech company-related foundations that spend a lot of money. How is the funding situation right now?
Well, like you said before, in spite of politics, the funding for science has continued to be pretty robust. It could be maybe more strategic, and that's a different argument, but it's fairly robust, and so I can't complain. But I would say that decision-making is a little bit more complicated, and how you talk to the funders and figure out how to get it. But if I could pivot back to something that Ottoline said, which is about Ottoline, which is that this idea of why collaboration is so important, why making things public is so important. I spent the first 15 years of my career at Bell Laboratories, AT&T, which, as everybody knows, is where the transistor was invented. When it was invented, AT&T was a monopoly, and so they couldn't convert that into IP. Imagine if they owned the patent on a transistor, it would be worth a little bit today. It wasn't. They had to give it away for $1. And so the argument that we had to make to the senior leadership at the company is to why would we have science research? Because we'd always say, well, we'll invent a transistor, and they would say, we got $1 for that. What's the value in that? The argument's exactly that. It's kind of all boats get lifted. So AT&T could never be what it is today without having the transistor invented. Neither could Google, neither could Intel, et cetera, but the argument was that all boats get lifted. I'm not sure that argument always works in international competitiveness, but it is an important argument. And I think that's the argument we make as scientists in the US, is sharing. It raises all boats. So if we don't collaborate with the UK and Germany and the rest of the EU and the rest of the world, Russia and everywhere, China even, there aren't enough people to solve all the problems if you don't do that.
Thank you very much. Further questions?
Let's see if we have a question in the room. I see a question over here. If you could just wait for the microphone, and a reminder to our audience to keep your questions brief so we can fit in as many as possible.
Thank you very much. Matthias von Gilmansek, Federal Ministry of Education and Research. When we want to make a greater step of research reforms, we always have to look at the elements of pushing and of pulling. And now, at least if we talk about reform of quality, not just quantity. Now, here is my question concerning especially the transatlantic relationship. Should we rather concentrate On the pulling side, that means maybe pouring more money into the existing schemes, easing the possibilities for scientific collaboration, or should we rather concentrate on the pushing side, which could mean setting up a common funding scheme between European Union and United States, setting up a common funding scheme body, maybe a kind of prototype of a transatlantic Horizon 2025. What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Is there a European or American perspective? Eric, please.
I'll try to keep it short because I don't want to. But I would say it's not really about the funding. It's how the problems are picked. And I think one thing we could imagine, which would change the way we do things, is not to have your chemist in one lab doing electrochemistry and a battery engineer in another lab. I think thinking about the kinds of teams you need to build around the battery to build a better battery is what really it's about. And that could be done on a global level. That can be something where you say, everyone needs a better battery. So how do we attack that problem? And you need physicists, chemists, you need even biologists, you need engineers, and you need the people who are communicating, the politicians. You do need the funding mechanism, but I would say the approach to science and the utilization of the instruments and the people could be very much global. I'm not sure, the funding piece would probably follow if you had the good ideas. That would be my guess. But the different approach to how you solve these problems would be my answer.
UK research and innovation is about money, but also about strategy.
Absolutely, and I think what you've highlighted here is the tension in a lot of systems, and particularly in the science system, between bottom-up and top-down, and letting the thousand flowers bloom, having the schemes available for that bottom-up driven creativity is absolutely crucial, but understanding what's going on right across the landscape from that point of view, and then aligning one's additional investment to capture the opportunities from that collaborative benefit, I think is really, really important. And one of the things I'm excited about with my organization, UK Research and Innovation, it's a relatively new organization, and it has brought together a huge chunk of the public sector funding landscape in the UK, right across the disciplines and right across the sectors. We include the UK's Innovation Agency, Innovate UK, as well as the Arts and Humanities Research Council and anything else in between. And those two things work a lot together in the creative industries, for example. So it is about capturing the understanding of the bottom-up in the service of the top-down. And it's quite a difficult juggle, and it's not easy for a lot of politicians, for example, to understand how you will let that organic stuff work in a way that services the key challenges of the day. And I'm excited that we're now having these kinds of conversations, and we can think about that at the national scale, but also internationally, how we can all align our research and innovation strategies to deliver for the world beyond what any one country can do.
Thank you. Charlotte, you have to juggle with a lot of issues. One is that CERN has to develop a new strategy, and you need the respective governments to buy into that strategy. How do you manage this challenge? And this can be a day-long talk if you condense it into 30 seconds, please.
If I can condense that into 30 seconds. Well, to some extent, this comes back to the convention of the organization, that by convention, it's all about pooling resources. And of course, there is exactly the bottom-up and the top-down approach. So there is a strategy which brings together all the scientists that come together every 5 to 7 years and discuss what they think is the next frontier in the science, and that then gets presented to governments, who then also discuss it. They're part of the process, and decisions are then made in terms of what the strategy is. So it is exactly a way of aligning the bottom-up and the top-down approach, and then finding out where do we want to go together. Because you can't just have a bottom-up approach, because you also need to set priorities. Because, of course, if you ask the community, they want to do absolutely everything. There will not be enough resources for that. So you need to marry the two approaches, but you do need to make scientific decisions based on good input from bottom-up.
Thank you very much. Let me turn around my shoulder and look around my shoulder and see whether there are further questions.
There are, but unfortunately the clock just this second hit 0, so I will pass back to you.
Then maybe do we have a second for a last round?
If everyone's answers are incredibly brief.
My last round and my last question. Sibylle, Günter, you said we look for new opportunities and new funding mechanisms for new issues. if I may ask everybody, what are opportunities for action that you see? And Sibylle, I would like to ask you first. You said we have to look for joint funding of competitive international projects. Any ideas or more concrete ideas on that?
Well, in fact, I would open some of the European research agencies to that. I mean, one example, for example, which is a smaller one, but we are collaborating with Princeton University in the Max Planck Princeton Center. So we did get funding from each of our national bodies, but it was a joint approach, it was a joint proposal, and it's much more than the sum of the two. So I'm looking forward to things like this, and I would open the European funds for some of the issues, looking at, of course, the right kind of priorities.
Innovative ideas from UK research and innovation?
I think a massive international priority is getting some kind of data commons, some kind of trusted, well-regulated, supported by our values, data commons, which will transform so many different industries and scientific fields.
Charlotte?
I would agree with that. I think having the mechanisms in place to share data and manage data over time, I think, is absolutely vital. And I think it's an urgent challenge that we haven't really quite even begun to come to grips with.
Best practice or innovative ideas from the Carnegie
I think we know how to
Institute?
do this. I would say it this way. We know how to do it. We've done it in big physics problems. We're doing it in astronomy now. We're building these huge telescopes to look at the origins of the universe and see if there's life on other planets. Those are two pretty big questions. Basic science, I mean, I agree they won't necessarily solve the climate problem, but we know how to do it. And I think when you have that really important challenge, like climate change or like is there life on another planet, people will find a way to fund it jointly. We have that going on now. CERN is a good example. The Extremely Large Telescope program, where Europe has one, there are a few going on around the world. We're doing it. So I think we have good examples as to how to do it.
Last but not least, Darion.
Yes. Vision. We need vision. And so one example of this is the Earthshot initiative, where we're trying to lower the cost of hydrogen energy to below $1 per kilogram. This is something that I agree with Eric. Once you have the vision there and it requires all of these disciplines to contribute, the funding will come, and everyone contributes what they can contribute. But it's essential that we have a common vision about what the problems are and how we're going to try and solve them.
Thank you very much. And for a closing remark, 4 times thank you. Number 1, thank you to the Falling Walls Foundation who brought this panel together. Thank you to DESY, the German Elektronen-Synchrotron in Hamburg, that was instrumental for this round of discussion. Thanks to the wonderful people here on the stage. And last but not least, thanks to you all for being with us here at this session this afternoon. Thank you very much.